Welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs conference call series. My name is Dennis Hoover, Vice President for Research and Publications at IGE, and I'll serve as the moderator on today's call. Our topic is U.S. government efforts to protect religious minorities abroad. And our speaker today, Knox Thames, is especially well qualified to address these critically important issues. Knox holds the newly created position of Special Advisor for Religious Minorities in the Near East and in South and Central Asia at the U.S. State Department. For over a decade and a half, Knox has worked in various U.S. government capacities, including at foreign policy commissions. He's an expert on a range of international issues, including human rights, religious freedom, international organizations, and countering extremism. Most recently, he was the Director of Policy and Research at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Prior to that, he served in the Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department and was counsel for 6 years at the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's a frequent contributor to IGE's journal, The Review of Faith and International Affairs, and he is co-author with Chris Seipel and Amy Rowe of International Religious Freedom Advocacy, published by Baylor University Press in 2009. Before we get started, just a few words on today's call format. We'll begin with 20 minutes of remarks from Knox, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please press 5* in the call, and you'll be placed in the queue. Please also note that this call is on the record, and an audio recording will be made available on the IGE website. So, with that introduction, let's turn now to our call. Thanks again, Knox, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. 1 month ago, I visited Lebanon and met with religious leaders and refugees from religious minority communities from Syria and Iraq. Lebanon is a country with many religious groups and one of 3 countries that is also bearing the brunt of incredible refugee flows from Syria. The refugees told heartbreaking stories of tragic loss of loved ones and expressed a profound sense that they could never return home. One family, tragically, had 32 cousins who had been kidnapped by ISIL. Going home wasn't an option for them. I have to say I was inspired by their bravery. And yet at the same time, it's tragic to watch what some say is the gradual world religion from the region of its birth. As we approach Christmas, many are asking, how much longer will Christmas be celebrated in its ancestral homeland? And while Christians have suffered greatly in this region, their experience is shared by millions of fellow Syrians and Iraqis, both Muslim and non-Muslim. This shared suffering raises another question. For how long will religious diversity and pluralism survive in the region? The situation has reached a crisis point, and within this context, I was appointed about 3 months ago to serve as the first special advisor on religious minorities in the Near East and South and Central Asia at the State Department. It's been a busy 90 days. I went straight from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom to the State Department, not wanting to lose any time to get started. But it's also been a productive time, and in our conversation this afternoon, I'll share an update on some of my activities to date and activities of the U.S. government as a whole. Also discuss the threats faced by religious minority communities in the Near East and South and Central Asia, and of course would welcome feedback and further ideas on phone. The Obama administration asked me to take this role to help address the ways in which religious minorities are repressed and what the Pew Foundation has referred to as a rising tide of restrictions on religious freedom. This is a crisis that is emerging worldwide. The protection and promotion of religious freedom is a core priority, however. It reflects American values and smart diplomacy. It's a fundamental freedom recognized in international law. And while protecting religious freedom is the right thing to do, we also care about religious freedom because it plays a large role in other areas as well. Studies have found that where religious freedom is respected, where you have the freedom to believe or not believe as your conscience dictates, societies are more stable, progressive, and dynamic. When religious minorities are protected, we've seen that their creativity and talent can be unleashed for the betterment of the entire country, both around the world, and also we've seen that here at home. But this focus on religious minority comes at a time when religious diversity and pluralism are under attack worldwide. But what do we mean by a minority? The simplest answer is that a minority group is a category of people differentiated from the social majority. This could be religious groups, ethnic groups, economic groups, or others. But looking specifically at religious groups, you realize that every faith community is a minority somewhere. As a result, this work is very context-specific. It includes Christians in the Middle East, Yazidis in Iraq, and Baha'is in Iran. It includes Hindus in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Muslims in India. It also includes Sunni Muslims in Shia areas and Shia Muslims in Sunni areas. It even includes members of the majority faith community who have drawn different theological conclusions and are the target of persecution from government or societal actors. It also means those who choose to hold no beliefs. And so in this new position, I want to bring a holistic view. From the 15 years of work in this field, I've seen how environments that respect religious freedom for all, freedom to believe or not to believe, to follow one's conscience, those environments are the ones that will be the most welcoming for minorities. So what are the threats that we see today? The threats to religious freedom and religious minorities are clear and present. The most recent State Department report on international religious freedom identified terrorist organizations and other non-state actors as some of the worst persecutors of religious minorities. The barbarity of terrorist groups like ISIL, the Nusra Front, and Al-Qaeda and others is well documented and well known. It is clear that groups of people have been targeted because of their religion. In Iraq and Syria, Yazidis, Christians, Turkmen Shia, Sunnis, and others have all suffered grievously. ISIL has systematically destroyed churches, Shia and Sunni mosques and shrines, and other religious sites. Even worse, ISIL is extending its reach beyond Iraq and Syria. Throughout the regions, Christians and members of other religious minority communities have been targeted by ISIL for persecution because of their faith. For example, earlier this year in Libya, ISIL similarly executed groups of Egyptian, Eritrean, and Ethiopian Christians who were foreign workers there. South Asia is not immune either. People have been targeted because of their religion or beliefs across the subcontinent. For instance, violent extremists in Pakistan have attacked Shias, Ahmadis, Christians, Hindus, and other groups. Even secular bloggers in Bangladesh have been murdered. And then we have the phenomenon of individual attackers, people who aren't terrorists but act criminally when they perpetrate acts of violence against religious minorities. In Pakistan, there have been instances of mobs attacking, burning the homes of, or killing Ahmadis and Christians accused of blasphemy. In India, violent attacks on Christian churches in several cities in the past year have occurred. And since September, we have seen at least 4 mob killings of Muslims allegedly involved in cow slaughter. Yet repression doesn't just come from terrorists, non-state actors, and societal actors. Governments continue to limit the exercise of religious freedoms in many ways. This is unfortunate because governments have an obligation with respect to the protection of human rights and should promote an environment of tolerance and non-discrimination. So how are we responding? In both principle and action, where people are endangered, threatened, or face discrimination, we are working vigorously to find ways to help. President Obama and Secretary Kerry have repeatedly raised concerns about limitations on religious freedom and the plight of religious minorities. And David Saperstein, the Ambassador-at-Large for International Religious Freedom, has done tremendous work to further advance the cause of religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy. But our first and fundamental goal is to try to create and sustain the conditions under which religious minorities can remain in their homes. This includes trying to see that the refugees I met with in Lebanon have a place to return to that respects their rights, preserves historic artifacts and buildings, and allows them to live in peace. The United States has acted to protect minority groups in imminent danger. In the context of Iraq in August of 2014, as ISIL began its attacks on the Yazidis on Mount Sinjar, President Obama ordered airstrikes to help break the siege and avert atrocities. A month later, in September, our airstrikes, in coordination with ground operations by Iraqi forces, broke ISIL's 2-month siege of the Iraqi town of Amarili, where an estimated 15,000 Turkmen Shia were surrounded. And thanks to the good work of Ambassador David Saperstein and others in the Religious Freedom Office, we now have good lines of communication with CENTCOM should religious communities come under direct attack from ISIL or other terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria. This connectivity was activated when ISIL attacked Christian villages in the Khabur River Valley in February. Beyond these immediate security issues, we have provided billions in humanitarian assistance to Syrians and Iraqis, including to refugees and displaced populations. Since 2008, the U.S. has provided more than $100 million in assistance to specifically related to religious and ethnic minority communities for a variety of efforts that include promoting respect for minority rights and interfaith tolerance, community stabilization, conflict mitigation, and cultural preservation. And currently, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where I'm situated, supports programs supporting religious and ethnic minorities and religious tolerance in several countries in the Near East and South and Central Asia. And with the new resources likely to be coming to us in the next budget, we will look to do more. I understand there has been a lot of discussion about the possible question of genocide being committed by ISIL. While I can't get into that topic specifically, I can say that last week I met with the team supporting the Atrocities Prevention Board and had a wide-ranging discussion about religious communities that could be victimized in the near future so that we can get ahead of the curve and ensure proactive U.S. diplomacy. In addition, during this Christmas season, which is celebrated first in December for Catholics and Protestants and then in January for Orthodox Christians, we're looking at ways to encourage countries to provide security at gathering sites to help prevent terrorist attacks. We're also raising concerns about the potential for future attacks around other major religious holidays of other communities, including Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Baha'is. But when acts of violence occur and people feel a constant state of threat, they may flee to seek safety. That is their prerogative. And when these individuals and families cannot return home or locally integrate, resettlement becomes an important tool of protection. The United States is deeply committed to providing refuge to the world's most vulnerable people when those other options are not available. In the context of Iraq and Syria, many refugees who have been resettled or who are currently under consideration for U.S. resettlement are Christians, Yazidis, and other religious and ethnic minorities. We recognize the unique needs of vulnerable religious minority communities in the region, and we are responding. For example, the safety and rights of members of religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq are issues of long-standing concern to the State Department. Of the more than 127,000 Iraqi refugees the United States has admitted since 2007, nearly 40% are members of religious minorities. At the same time, we want to help all who have suffered and are vulnerable. We recognize that ISIL has also targeted both Shia and Sunni Muslims who have resisted their violent and abhorrent ideological practices. The Assad regime has also been a horrible persecutor and indiscriminate in its attacks on civilian areas. The emphasis of our refugee resettlement program is on admitting the most vulnerable. Now, the atrocities that ISIL is committing in the Middle East against minorities aren't limited to individuals. I'm very concerned by efforts of ISIL and other groups to destroy churches and other cultural heritage sites. They are literally working to erase history and further cut the ties of these communities to the region. ISIL's campaign of deliberate destruction has resulted in the loss of culturally and religiously significant sites, such as in Syria, where the Arch of Triumph was destroyed with explosives in Palmyra, and in Iraq, where ISIL deliberately demolished the Tomb of Jonah. So in the coming year, I'm planning to start an effort to work with religious communities in the region to educate them on the importance of proactively cataloging sacred items. Cataloging items is important because it makes them easier to recover if they're looted or sold. And I think this is so important because if the United States is to successfully protect and help recreate conditions where religious communities feel a connection to their ancestral homelands and wish to stay, more effort is needed to protect the places and things that connect them to the land. And in this effort, we are also examining states' education materials that teach exclusion and discrimination. No child should be taught that the religious other is not to be valued because of their different faith or belief system. Sadly, a generation or more of children have been exposed to intolerant and sometimes violent messages in the classroom. So we are working to find ways to provide a counter-narrative that teaches the value and beauty of diversity and respect for human rights and religious freedom. But governments have a critically important role to play. To see a future where religious diversity is respected and protected, governments must play their fundamental role of protecting minorities. Yet sometimes governments are part of the problem and not the solution. When that is the case, we will continue to pressure governments to reform so that restrictive laws and policies are changed and members of religious minorities are able to practice their faith freely and peacefully. For instance, we oppose blasphemy laws around the world, including in places like Egypt and Pakistan, and call for their universal repeal. And for those governments that are somewhere in between, we will work to find ways to encourage positive steps. Because with the full participation of all individuals, including religious minorities, societies can much better unleash human talent and advance human dignity that strengthens peace, security, and prosperity. So here are some examples. In Iraq, we have welcomed Prime Minister Abadi's emphasis of a zero-tolerance policy for human rights violations and abuses, and his call for the protection of religious minorities. But we are also troubled by legislative efforts which appear to curtail the religious freedom of minors by forcing them to change their faith if their father converts to Islam. We have called on the Iraqi government to review this effort and ensure that it acts consistent with its constitution and its international obligations and commitments regarding freedom of religion or belief. Legislation like this can send an ominous signal to minority religious communities that they are not viewed as equal and their members' human rights can be abused by the majority. Such policies will only promote greater immigration out. In Egypt, there are positive signs regarding the treatment of religious minorities, although discrimination against Copts and other faith groups generally continues. President Sisi attended the Christmas Eve Mass at the Coptic Orthodox St. Mark Cathedral, becoming the first Egyptian president to do so. At its own expense, the military completed the rebuilding of 26 of the 78 churches and their Christian buildings burned following the removal of the Muslim Brotherhood-led government in July 2013. However, on the other hand, the government's general use of reconciliation sessions in response to sectarian violence regularly fails to punish perpetrators or provide restitution to minority parties, and this continues to support a climate of impunity. The government also continues to prosecute individuals for denigrating religions under the Penal Code. Now the challenge is, with the new parliament seated, we hope President Sisi will work with the parliament to ensure that the constitutionally mandated church building law is passed. And while the government has taken steps to protect Coptic Christians, atheists and Shia Muslims face ongoing restrictions and interference with the practice of their religion. In Saudi Arabia, the practice of non-Muslim faith is prohibited in public, and the construction of churches, synagogues, and other non-Muslim places of worship is illegal. Regarding Muslim minorities, Shia and other Muslims considered non-conforming, they have experienced significant government and public discrimination in worship and religious practice, religious expression, political engagement, employment, and education. In Iran, we are particularly concerned about the treatment of religious minorities. Christians are detained apparently for no other reason than the peaceful exercise of their Christian faith, and their house churches are shut down. Sunni Muslims are barred from building houses of worship, and Sunni leaders have been executed for enmity against God. We're also especially worried about the case of the 7 Baha'i leaders who were arrested in 2008 and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. In Pakistan, we have welcomed recent Supreme Court judgments condemning acts of vigilantism. However, Pakistani law is problematic. It prohibits Ahmadis from calling themselves Muslims or for preaching or propagating their religious beliefs, which includes punishments of up to 3 years in jail. Christians and Muslims also both suffer from enforcement of Pakistan's blasphemy law. And then across Central Asia, religious minorities and majorities suffer from religious freedom abuses, such as in Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. So in conclusion, there is much work to be done, but we have seen success. It's because of the advocacy of many on the phone and elsewhere that this position that I now hold was created. It's because of the effective advocacy work that the Religious Freedom Office here at the State Department, the position of the Ambassador at Large, and USCIRF were created over 15 years ago. These are significant accomplishments, but we can't be satisfied. The persecutors of religious minorities continue to commit atrocities. The church bells in Mosul have rung for 1,600 years, but will again be silent this Christmas. The Yazidi Center of Faith in Lalish faces a persistent and grave threat. Other communities of Muslims, Hindus, Baha'is, and other faiths have also been persecuted by state and non-state actors. If this diversity is lost, if this historic pluralism fades away, the world will experience a grave loss. Now, the United States is doing a lot, and we're looking for ways to do more. Yet we can't do this alone. The global climate of violent extremism and government repression needs a multinational response. And by working with like-minded nations in Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia, we can increase our ability to respond with durable solutions that help grow space for diversity of thought and belief. Towards that goal, the White House announced during the papal visit that the State Department will hold a conference on the protection of religious minorities in the Middle East and South Central Asia to bring together civil society and religious leaders with senior government officials from around the world to focus on mobilizing additional resources and developing practical steps to protect vulnerable religious communities. We're working now to develop a plan for that meeting, and hopefully I'll have more to say in the new year. But together, as a community of values, both governmental, civil society, and faith communities, we can have impact. This is tough work, and I'm under no illusion that victories will come early or often. The attacks on religious pluralism and diversity of thought will be the defining issue of the 21st century. So to be effective, we must redouble our efforts to advance human rights, while also expanding our work to protect cultural and religious heritage, building interfaith relations, and promoting tolerance. So during this Christmas season, there remains reason for hope. The refugees I met with in Lebanon, they are hopeful for a better future, and we are working hard to help that day be realized. And among the many examples I could cite, one stands out in my mind. The Assyrian Church of the East recently moved its church seat back to Erbil from Chicago. So in spite of the threats its members face, in spite of the migration out of Iraq, the Church of the East went back in. I salute their courage. We also should salute their courage, and we should take inspiration from it as we work together to confront this challenge. So I want to thank IGE for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Knox. Fascinating tour of some very challenging terrain and some encouraging things on the horizon coming from your office, and we're all grateful that it's you in this new important role in the State Department. I'm sure our callers are eager to dive into discussion with you, so we will now open the lines for questions. As a reminder to audience members, if you'd like to ask a question, please press 5 star. When it's your turn to ask your question, today's call administrator, Lindsay Kunz, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you may ask it. The lines will be placed back on mute immediately after the asking a question. Please note also that if you are already in the queue and for any reason decide you no longer wish to ask your question, you can press 5 star again, and that will erase your number from the queue. Finally, for the sake of all the callers, I'll ask that when you're called upon to ask a question, please ask it concisely rather than providing your own commentary. So without further ado, Lindsay, our first question, please.
Sure thing. Thank you again, Knox, for those remarks. So our first question today is going to come from Lauren Homer. Lauren, your line has been unmuted, so please ask your question.
Hi, Knox.
Hi, Lauren.
Thanks for your nice presentation. I wanted to ask about the admission of minority refugees. You mentioned that some consideration is being given to changing the policies on, I believe, Syrian refugees. You mentioned that 40% of Iraqi refugees were from minority groups, and that's a little different than what, at least officially, we've heard President Obama say. So I wonder if you could elaborate on the thought process and what we might expect in the way of minority preferences from Syria.
Thanks, Lauren, for that question. Yeah, first, sort of as a fundamental point, the United States, we're committed to assisting people, all religions, ethnicities, and nationalities who are fleeing persecution, violence, and other drivers of displacement. I think the United States has much to be proud of in the way we've been a refuge for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who are fleeing persecution because they've been singled out because of their faith, their ethnicity, or political views. But the emphasis of the refugee admissions program has always been on helping the most vulnerable. And so because of the way of ISIL's singling out of religious minorities in Iraq and Syria, many of those who we are currently assisting are Christians, Yazidis, and other religious and ethnic minorities. And I have some other figures here I can look at. In fiscal year 2015, we admitted approximately 1,700 Syrian refugees, and according to the figures I've been given, about 3% of those were members of religious minorities, including Christians. Some pre-war demographics indicate that Christians made up about 10% of the population of Syria, and what we're getting from UNHCR is that Christians account for only about 1.2% of the approximately 2 million Syrian refugees who are in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. And approximately 0.1% are members of other minority religious groups. We've also seen that there are Syrians of all faiths who are choosing not to register with UNHCR for a variety of reasons. But when we've asked, we have heard no reports of refugees facing obstacles to register with UNHCR due to their ethnic or religious background. But at the same time, I know in my previous work and just throughout my career that means that doesn't mean it hasn't happened, and that doesn't mean it won't happen. So I know there's been an incredible amount of energy and focus placed on the question of Christians, Syrians leaving, and other religious minorities fleeing. And so if you have information about limitations in the registration process or groups that aren't getting hooked into the UNHCR system, please let me know, and I will do what I can to make sure that information gets to where it needs to go so we can ensure that anybody who's persecuted because of their faith and wishes to flee has the opportunity to find a safe haven somewhere.
Thank you, Lauren, for your question, and Knox for that answer. Our next question is going to come from Mr. Robert Halis, Member of Parliament. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this very important information. And I agree with you, Knox, in everything that you said. It's very important to help each other. It's it's not so easy to handle this situation, and together we will be strong. And I hope we will in the future bring this area in the Middle East the peace, freedom, and democracy. I want to say a few words about the situations of the Christians in the Middle East. There is an ongoing genocide against Christians in Syria and in Iraq, and this is known by everybody. I mean, this is happening now while I'm speaking to you, and the most of the refugees who left Syria and Iraq, the Christians, which are the most of them living in the north Iraq, they went back to their homes in Mosul, etc., and they need to be protected, and they need protection and safety, etc., etc. So this is a very big challenge, and together I think we will try to do the best for these people, to bring them freedom, etc. My question is about the situations in Syria and the negotiations about the future of the new Syria. Now in UN they have did a lot of meetings in Switzerland and in Vienna, and I can't see any real representing of the Christians. They are at 10% of the populations in Syria, and they are suffering a lot. And they should be a part of this discussion of freedom, peace, and new developments in Syria. So my question is, how can we make the voice of the Christians also to be a part of these negotiations and the changing of a new Syria?
Thank you, Robert. It's good to hear your voice, and I think it's a very important question you're asking. I know that the different communiques that have been issued in this latest round of diplomacy looking to find a political resolution to the crisis in Syria has stated that Syria's religious and ethnic diversity is something that must be protected, that a future Syria must respect the rights of its minorities, both ethnic and religious. And I think that's really important. The Christians and the Alawites, they have both generally through history been supportive of the Assad, both the father and now the son, because the government provided them space where they could exist, gave them respected their worship rights. But it was in a context of where human rights were generally not respected. And when now they're facing a situation between the regime, its brutality, or ISIL and its horrific acts against religious minorities, they're in a very difficult and precarious situation. So, we are working to see that any transition takes into account Syria's diversity, and that it's protected, and that goes into the post-conflict planning. But it's going to be a tough, long road ahead, and I think it's an issue that we all need to remain focused on and continue to raise.
Thank you, Knox. Our next question comes from Peter Probe with the World Council of Churches.
Hi. You can hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi, Peter Probe, Director for International Affairs at the World Council of Churches. Actually, I can also offer a little bit of information in response to the previous question. We have been convening in coordination with the succession of special envoys on Syria, a number of consultations of religious leaders, including Christian leaders as well as Muslim leaders in the margins of the Geneva I and Geneva II political processes. So for what it's worth, that's some information. I have a question about how your current mandate, Knox, interacts with that of Ambassador Saperstein, and also the responsibilities of folks like Sean Casey and Peter Mandeville at State Department.
Yes. I work very closely with all of them. I'm based in the Office of International Religious Freedom along with Ambassador Saperstein, and I've known David for many years and was thrilled when he took up this position, and in the 3 months I've been here, I've been just very impressed of the excellent work he's done to energize and further focus U.S. diplomacy on promoting religious freedom. So we work collaboratively. The ambassador at large role is a global mandate. Mine is still quite large, but it is limited to the Near East and South and Central Asia. So at times we're tag teaming. We're going into meetings together. At other times, you know, when he was traveling to one country, I was going to a different country, so that we can just double the number of advocates coming from the State Department on these issues. Sean Casey's office is one we coordinate closely with, and they are partners in helping sharpen the U.S. government's understanding of religious dynamics and to find new partners in ways to advance U.S. foreign policy goals. So they're definitely friends, and we meet with them regularly.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Alan McDonald, pastor of Global Engagement at Fairfax Community Church. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Good afternoon, Knox. I want to ask you about Pakistan, and I know you've had a long involvement there, both at a professional level and have some deep relationships. And I just would like to kind of hear your assessment of where things stand now. Is there greater traction or increasing traction for space for religious pluralism, or just what your sense is of the direction things are going in Pakistan in relation to religious pluralism?
Great. Yeah. Hi, Alan. Thanks for your question. Pakistan, I think, is a really tough place to be a religious minority, but it's tough to be a Pakistani. The country has a lot of challenges on a number of levels. Regarding respect for religious minorities and religious freedom, there have been some bright spots in the last 6 to 9 months that I think are worth noting, and one of my efforts is going to be to try to work with the Pakistanis to bolster those good things that we're starting to see sprout up from the ground. One has been a general reduction in violence against religious minorities. In my old job, we over a couple of years did a lot of research and just documenting acts of violence against religious communities in Pakistan. And there was a real spike about 2 years ago, and since then it seems like it continues to reduce. That's not to say violence doesn't happen. There was, in the last month or 6 weeks, an attack on an Ahmadi Muslim home where the home was burned down by a mob because they just didn't like Ahmadis. They had disagreements with their faith. And while that was heinous, we had not seen attacks like that in some time. And what's really worth noting is how the Pakistani government responded. The police went in and tried to push back the attackers. And then when that didn't work, the army sent in its rangers to help secure the site. And I've been following Pakistan for a while. I've never heard of that happening. So that's encouraging. That's the kind of role we want to see governments playing in putting themselves between the persecutor and the persecuted. We've also seen a slowing of blasphemy charges being made and a real drop in the number of convictions. And in fact, the Supreme Court has issued two interesting decisions in the past 2 years. One saying that sort of tasking the government with creating special training for police to protect religious minorities and a special commission on minorities. And then more recently, in the trial of the killer of the governor of Punjab, who had been accused of making blasphemous statements, and his bodyguard killed him. In the trial of the bodyguard, the court had a very clear statement that, questioning the blasphemy law is not blasphemy, and creating space in that society for those discussions about, well, how do we make, either repeal this law, which is what we're ultimately hoping to see, but in the near term, reform it so that it can't be abused. And we've seen the court really go out in a way that's commendable. So, is the glass half full or half empty? That's really hard to say. But there are some bright spots that I'm hoping in this new position to be able to partner with the Pakistanis to find ways to grow and increase those so that all Pakistanis, regardless of faith, can enjoy the most fundamental human rights of belief and conscience.
Thanks, Knox. We had a question that was emailed in from a caller who had to leave, so I'm going to go ahead and ask that on their behalf. You shared some of the places you had already traveled, but they're just interested in what was on the docket for the coming year.
Yeah. So far in the 90 days, I represented the U.S. government at a conference the Greeks held in Athens focusing on religious diversity in the Middle East. That was really useful because all the church fathers of the Orthodox world attended. You had His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch from the Greek Orthodox Church, the different archbishops, representatives from Iraq, the Chaldean and Syriac Orthodox churches, and that was a very useful way to just make contacts in one place. Also been to Turkey for a conference, and then Lebanon. And then in the new year, I'm planning to attend a conference in Morocco where a group of Islamic scholars will be coming together to issue a declaration on the rights of religious minorities in Islam. And I'll be planning to visit Pakistan and Iraq as well in the first 3 months. And as other opportunities present themselves or needs arise, I can make adjustments. But I'm trying to get out into the field to meet with people to get a sense of get a sense of the situation and to learn, what's possible for U.S. diplomacy to advance to help create space and security for religious minorities.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Mona Malik with the Assyrian Aid Society of America. Mona, I'm trying to unmute your line. All right, I think you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you, Mr. Thames, for your remarks. And my question is, since your appointment in September, has the focus of your position and the focus of the State Department been mostly to rescue the refugees or to help them in their indigenous lands? Mainly the $100 million that you had mentioned, was that toward supposed to be helping toward the refugees or helping the displaced indigenous people, the minorities, in their own lands?
Yep. That money was used programmatically to help build capacity among minority communities or other actors who focus on issues of concern to minorities so that they can better protect their human rights or understand how to advocate for themselves in their own context. So that was programmatic money and not refugee money. The refugee money is just, I don't have those figures right in front of me, but it's very significant, and but that's helping displaced peoples regardless of faith or ethnicity. As far as priorities, I'm pursuing both at the same time. I think first and foremost, looking at protection issues. How do we protect religious minorities where they are or where they fled? How do we, as I've talked about, create the conditions where religious minorities don't have to leave, or if it's in a conflict zone, how do we recreate the conditions so they'll be able to go back home? And that ties into refugee issues, internally displaced people. It's a State Department issue. It's USAID. It's DOD. So there's lots of different actors involved, and I'm getting now 90 days in. I'm getting a good sense of the lay of the land and what are the different offices and agencies I need to engage with, so that we can maximize our efforts. But at the same time, I'm really impressed with how much we're doing. The U.S. government is so involved in this. We're the largest donor by far of any country as far as aid to Iraq and Syria. And we're trying to encourage our European friends and other friends in like Japan and Australia and other countries to give more, because it's not enough. The UN calls for donations are really underfunded, and that's resulting in food shortages in the World Food Program, which has reverberations. And why are people risking their lives in rubber dinghies trying to get to Greece? Well, so while we're trying to do a lot ourselves, we're also trying to encourage our partners to step up the plate in a bigger way, so that we can meet the needs of people where they are and where they fled, and they can stay closer to home, so when conditions stabilize, they can get back quickly and safely.
Looks like Peter Prove has another question. So Peter, go ahead and ask it again.
Yeah, thank you. I have a specific question related to the constitutional drafting process in the Kurdistan region. I wonder if you have a sense of how that is currently playing out in terms of the reflection or respect of the rights of religious minorities, because from our point of view, there were some concerns about that.
It's something we're following very closely. I can't get into the specific ways that we're engaging the Kurds on that, but we're very mindful of it, and we have a very robust dialogue with Kurdish officials. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, I'll be meeting with the Kurdish representative here in Washington to talk about a whole range of issues. But it is definitely something that we're closely monitoring.
All right, and Mona, did you have another follow-up question as well?
Yes, please, if you don't mind.
Please.
Go for it.
My follow-up question is regarding a little bit of about what Peter just mentioned, and that is, when you're discussing that the United States is one of the largest donors toward this crisis, have you considered, or has your department considered, working with local NGOs run by the indigenous Yazidis and Assyrians that have been established for many, many years and have been approved by the USAID as a legit NGOs to work with?
I haven't gotten in deep enough in who we funded and why that I can really give an informed answer on that. I'm very aware that there are Yazidi and Assyrian NGOs that are doing really fantastic work in very tough places, and I can say generally that it's those kinds of civil society and representatives of religious communities that are so critical to any kind of work that we're going to do. So I hope, like I said, I hope to get to Iraq in early next year, and I'll be looking to meet with those kinds of organizations to get a sense of their ideas, their challenges, and to think about what are ways that the United States, publicly or privately, can further enhance their good work. Because really this is about, we can do a lot, but we've got to have local implementing partners who know the situation, have the community connections. They're a linchpin in any kind of sustainable effort to bring about stability, reconstruction, understanding of rights. So much of Iraq is broken, and it's going to take really an all hands on deck exercise to put the pieces back together. So in fact, maybe after the call, if you want to send me contacts of people that I need to be connected with, I'd very much welcome that.
All right, thank you, Knox. And Mona, if you need his contact information, just let me know after the call. All right, so there's currently no more questions in the queue, so we'll go ahead and give you all a couple seconds to think of one. And in the meantime, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Hoover for a question, please.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, Knox, I wanted to ask you a bit about other countries, partner countries with the U.S. I know in your work with Yusuf, you were part of a lot of exciting new initiatives on transatlantic cooperation on religious freedom, and so I'm wondering what ways there are to involve like-minded European governments or other governments in your current work.
Yeah. It's something we're thinking a lot about, and there are two bodies that we're looking to engage with. First is this International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, which was an effort I helped kickstart when I was at USERF to bring together parliamentarians from around the world who are committed to Article 18, which is the religious freedom article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and find new ways to sort of leverage political influence to see the rights of everybody, the belief rights of everyone, better respected. So I think when governments are part of the problem, if you remember that part of my presentation, I think that's where having parliamentarians engaged can be really useful and can bring a new voice to help encourage / pressure governments to do the right thing, to end their abusive policies or to take stronger policies for protection. The other initiative is something that our friend Andrew Bennett up in Canada, Andrew Bennett, who's done a fabulous job representing the Canadian government on religious freedom issues. He, along with Ambassador Saperstein, have been working to create a intergovernmental contact group on freedom of religion or belief, which is similar to the parliamentary effort, but is a network of foreign ministries and their points of contact who work on religious freedom issues, and to try to leverage governmental activity to see stronger representations made, but also to share information. So many European countries all have funding going abroad to create a space where people can say, okay, we're doing projects in Nigeria, Iraq, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and then learn if there's duplication or gaps so that those gaps can be filled. Like I said at the end of my statement, this problem is bigger than any one agency like the State Department or one country, even as powerful as the United States, can take on alone. And we're going to need to find allies who are committed to diversity of thought and belief, who respect the religious freedoms of their citizens, to push back against this rising tide of intolerance that is impacting everybody. And so that's been a hopeful space, but it's one that we're going to have to, in the new year, really focus on to make real and meaningful as we move forward.
Thanks for that question, Dennis, and your answer, Knox. Our next question comes from Mr. Ari Despatie with the World Evangelical Alliance.
Yeah, hi, Knox. This is Ari Despatie with the World Evangelical Alliance. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. You covered quite some countries already, but I didn't hear anything about India, and I'm not sure whether that's outside your remit or whether that's outside the scope, because recently we had a contact over from India, and he was quite concerned about the growing extremism from Hindu groups and the way they're attacking Christian communities and other faith groups in India. And this could be quite a strategic time to intervene and to try to counter that. So I was wondering whether that's on your agenda or whether that's outside your remit.
No, it absolutely is. And Ari, it's good to hear your voice. I did mention India in my presentation, but like you said, I was covering a lot of countries. I noted, our concern about the different attacks on Christian churches that have occurred in the past year in several cities, and also these horrific mob killings of Muslims who are allegedly involved in cow slaughter. So, India is a country of incredible diversity. It's a democracy. It's got an open media. At the same time, you've got these extreme voices that are acting out violently against religious minorities and people who believe differently than they do. And so we're thinking a lot about how do we engage the Indians to support the rule of law, to protect their traditions of diversity and respect for rights, and to really get a handle on what some are saying is a rise in sort of violent extremism, so that the rights of all Indians, Hindu, non-Hindu, Christian, Muslim, Baha'i, whomever, have the space to live out those beliefs free of any fear of violent attack or discrimination or intimidation being brought against them.
All right, thank you for that. It looks like Peter has another question. Peter, you can ask it again.
Yeah, sorry, me again. Speaking of other countries that hadn't been covered, I think, in the presentation, we just recently returned from a week-long visit to North Korea, which is part of our 30-year-long history of engagement with the Korean Christian Federation there. And on this occasion, we also established new contacts with the Korean Catholics Association. On the other hand, of course, we see now again the latest reports about the life sentence against the Presbyterian pastor from Canada. I'm just wondering to what extent North Korea issues feature in your work, and whether you have any particular orientation towards the situation there.
My remit is the Middle East and South and Central Asia, so Northeast Asia is outside my remit. Although I know for a fact that North Korea is a country of great concern to our office and the State Department, and it's one that Ambassador Saperstein, that falls in his basket, not mine, is definitely following very closely. So that's one where after the call, if we can be connected by email, I can make sure that you're connected with colleagues here who follow that country closely.
Thanks for that, Peter. I'll go ahead and email you Knox's contact when the call is over. It looks like we have a question from Maya. Maya, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, thanks for inviting me to this call. I'm curious to know more about U.S. engagement with Saudi Arabia on religious freedom and on countering extremism, given its long history and record of exporting hardline Wahhabism around the world. I mean, I've just come back from Afghanistan, and I was speaking to some human rights defenders from Kunduz province, and that you probably know that Kunduz recently fell to the Taliban. Fortunately, it was recaptured, and they were telling me that the place was crawling with Pakistani Taliban, and Pakistani madrasas are often funded by Saudi Arabia. So I'm just curious to know more about U.S. engagement with Saudi Arabia on these issues.
Those are definitely concerns that we pay a lot of attention to and discuss openly. You know, if you read the State Department's religious freedom reports, you can see how we identify a lot of these concerns that you raise. You know, we've talked about how, you know, in Saudi Arabia, for Saudis, if you're a non-Muslim, you can't practice your faith in public. You can't have a public place of worship. That's just flat out illegal. Even if you're a Muslim but not the right kind of Muslim or a Shia Muslim, there's extreme limitations from the government, and then also public discrimination impacting the ability of Shia and other Muslims to worship and to just practice the basic parts of their faith. On the education, you know, there have been a lot of problems with the Saudi textbooks that were exported. It's something that before I joined the State Department, there's been a lot of focus on here, and at my previous job at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So it's something we're very mindful of, and again, I would just offer to be connected with you afterwards to get more details about what you're seeing in Afghanistan, because it's really helpful to know if you're seeing these textbooks out in places like that, so we have a better sense of where this hateful rhetoric is being taught, so we can, you know, think of ways to try to counteract it or to provide different teaching materials.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Knox. Lindsay's let me know that we have no more questions in the queue, and we're just about up for our hour, so I will stop there and just say thanks for leading us in a very important conversation. Thanks to all the callers for joining us. And I hope you'll all join us again on our next Faith and International Affairs conference call, which will be on January 28th. And will feature Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, who's Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University and former Pakistani High Commissioner to the UK and Ireland. Ambassador Ahmed will discuss relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in the West and the findings of his recent book and film project titled Journey into Europe. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.